I don't know whether you're familiar with the library um, defacing by Joe Orton and Kenneth Halliwell. Joe Orton became one of the great British playwrights of the early 60s. And they were both prosecuted successfully, and they did jail time in 1962 for over a period of about 3 years, defacing a series of books. Um, some of the book phrase. There's one so up here. There's this one on that side there. Is a book about two very famous actors, the Lunts, and originally there was a picture of them looking rather serious on the front cover, and Joe Orton and Halliwell have replaced them with pictures of some Christmas toys. I know. And there's also a list of plays written by Emlyn Williams. Emlyn Williams is again a great playwright. He's sort of fallen out of favour. The Grass is Green is a play which I think is simply stunning. The corn is green. The corn is green. And uh, and their list of alternative titles is scurrilous and terribly rude, but very funny. The Great Tudors as well. Anyway, they were prosecuted, and they did time in jail. And when he came out of jail, Joe Orton had somehow taken that time to think, and this gestation period turned him into a great writer. The the prosecution was based on three acts: the Theft Act of 1916, though the modern Theft Act of 1968 hadn't quite come into law. The 1916 version defines theft as the dishonest appropriation of property belonging to another with the intent to permanently deprive the owner of it. By removing book covers, defacing books, and returning them altered, they arguably deprive the Islington Private Library of its property in its original condition. The Malicious Damage Act 1861, Section 51, this law criminalised the willful destruction or damage of property, and their actions, which involved cutting out book dust jackets and pasting new satirical artwork over them and altering the texts inside, were considered to have caused damage to public property. And the Public Libraries Act of 1892 and the bylaws, the libraries at the time operated under specific local regulations, and the Islington Public Library had clear rules about the desecration of the destruction of books. And so I thought it was very interesting in the United Kingdom to move on to a parallel story. In the United Kingdom, the act of burning a copy of the Quran, defacing a copy of the Quran in a public space, raises several legal and ethical questions. Now, if it were a library book, the person who did that could, of course, face the same penalties as Joe Orton and Kenneth Halliwell. I don't suppose this was a library book. I've always found in libraries, when I go into a library and see a copy of the Quran, and I find it on the bottom shelf, and I think, this is the wrong shelf. It needs to be put on the top shelf. That is the place to put a Quran. That it should be above any other book. But the local library staff don't always recognise that that principle. And while flag burning and defacing currency remain legal under UK law in most circumstances, I didn't know this when I was a child. And I used to send letters home and decorate the envelope lavishly, lots of curlicues and stuff. And sometimes these invaded the stamp. And I remember people in my school, masters in my school, priests telling me that I couldn't send that letter because I defaced the stamp and it was criminal damage. It wasn't, of course. They were over egging the omelette, and I think in fact it was before the Coinage Act in 1971 came in, So they might have been anticipating this and being overly careful, or it may just have been an opportunity to enforce control. But the Malicious Damage Act in 1861, which criminalizes the willful destruction or the damage of property, the key legal question in relation to burning a Quran would be ownership. And if the book belongs to the individual setting it on fire, then no clear property offence would have been committed. However, if the Quran is owned by another individual, by an institution, for example, taken from a library or a mosque, the act could amount to theft under the Theft Act of 1968, or criminal damage. And that brings us to the case of Joe Orton and Halliwell, which is instructive. They were convicted not for their artistic alterations or their satire per se, but because they had defaced books that were the property of a public library. And their crime was not vandalism in the abstract, but damage to publicly owned property. I think probably the books that they defaced are now worth a great deal more money than they were worth originally. If an individual were to burn a publicly owned copy of the Quran, say from a library, they could face similar legal consequences. Beyond property laws, burning a Quran in public could invoke legislation designed to prevent disorder and hate speech. So the Public Order Act of 1986, sections 4A and 5, prohibits threatening, abusive or insulting words and behaviour likely to cause harassment or alarm or distress. And given the fact that a passerby, a Deliveroo rider, was encouraged to get off his bike and start kicking the book burner, that, I suppose, is demonstrative of caused alarm, distress and harassment. The fact is, I think that Deliveroo driver then, in his own right, caused grievous bodily harm. It was an act of assault, I would have thought. Then there's the Religious and Racial Hatred Act of 2006, which criminalises acts that incite hatred against religious groups. And I would have thought that Quranic burning would fall into that category. A key legal precedent is the treatment of flag burning in the UK, which remains legal unless it provokes violence or breaches the peace. The same principle could apply to Quran burning. While the act itself may not be explicitly prohibited, the context, whether it incites hatred or public disorder, determines its legality. So flag burning is often treated as a form of political expression in the UK and elsewhere. In the UK, unlike in many other countries, there's no specific law against desecrating the national flag. Similarly, defacing the monarch's image on stamps or coins is not explicitly illegal, though destroying currency under the Coinage 1971 Act could lead to prosecution if it renders coins unfit for reusage, and by association, possibly stamps. But I think the teachers in my school when I was a child were overreacting. The case of Texas versus Johnson in 1989 in the US Supreme Court established that burning the American flag is protected as free speech under the First Amendment, but in the UK law, we don't have the same First Amendment principle, and we don't therefore have the same level of protection to symbolic speech when it crosses into hate speech or incitement to violence. But certainly in the 1970s, there were cases where people were taken to court for burning the American flag. The key distinction is intention, which is hard to prove, but while flag burning can be an act of protest, Quran burning could be viewed as an act intended to stir religious tension, and that then becomes much more serious. If an individual purchases a Quran and burns it in private, there is no theft or damage to another's property. However, if the act occurs in a public space or involves a book taken from a library or a religious institution, it could be prosecuted under the criminal damage laws, just as Joe Orton and Halliwell were prosecuted for defacing books. I think there's a case to be said that owning a Quran may not be a religiously possible concept, that a Quran is always effectively on loan to the person who has bought it or who takes care of it. But it would be a difficult case. It would be a difficult principle to establish in a British court of law, I think. And there are other there are other laws which can be invoked to prosecute somebody burning a Quran. Laws governing hate speech and public order, I think, could apply, particularly if the act is intended to provoke or to incite violence, which this clearly did. So while flag burning, currency defacement and symbolic acts of protest remain largely legal in the UK, Quran burning in public is a more complex issue, and unlike Joe Orton and Halliwell's subversive satire, which targeted library books as a medium rather than the ideas within them, burning a Quran may be interpreted as a direct attack on religious identity, on the ideas in the Quran, rather than a mere act of book burning. I think in principle we should be opposed to book burning, whether in public or in private, but whether those acts of immolation would constitute in themselves a criminal act, I'm less certain. But I think we should bear in mind the book burnings of the 1930s in Nazi Germany, and be very, very aware of the precedent that sets. Legally, the primary question is whether a book is privately owned, whether it's public property, or whether it's part of a religious institution. But beyond that, the Public Order Act and the Racial and Religious Hatred Act introduce additional considerations, making it possible for book burning to lead to prosecution under public order and incitement laws, even if it doesn't violate property laws. So, in short, sorry, I've gone on a little bit and I've moved quite a long way from the entertainment of Joe Orton and Kenneth Halliwell's brilliantly satirical book covers. In short, while burning a Quran may not always be theft or criminal damage, the legal and social consequences would likely depend on intention, ownership, and the context in which the act takes place, and the result of that act. I think the result of that act and what that act provokes is significant in determining whether or not a criminal case will be pressed.